Montana Territory, late summer of 1879. The sky was low with smoke from distant fires, and the girl in the cabin kitchen had not seen her own reflection in weeks. The door banged open hard enough to shake the walls. "Stu, now," barked one of the outlaws, a thick-set man whose voice was always louder when his boots were muddy. "And none of that watered-down garbage you tried last night, girl." Sable Corman kept her eyes down as she stirred the pot, the iron ladle clicking against the rim. Her hands were red from heat and soap, her apron stained with blood and broth. Across the rough wooden floor, two more men played cards, their rifles leaning against the table legs. They barely looked up. She had been cooking for this gang for almost 5 months. Not by choice. They had taken her from her father's homestead after they shot him and left her mother for dead. They had needed someone to cook, clean, and keep quiet. She had been 22 then. She had not had a choice. The cabin door creaked again, but this time it was not one of them. A lean figure stepped inside, his hat pulled low, coat dusty from the trail. He looked young, maybe 24, maybe less, but his eyes were sharp, and his movements were steady. Sable froze at the stove. "Who are you?" barked the man with the muddy boots, reaching for the revolver on the table. The stranger raised one hand slow and calm. "Name's Abner Whitlow. I was told a man named Cray runs this outfit." "He does," the man said, stepping toward him. "You got business?" "I heard Cray needs more riders. I can shoot, ride, and keep my mouth shut." The outlaws exchanged a look. The one called Cray, seated at the table with a cigar half smoked between his fingers, leaned back and squinted. "You come alone?" "I did." "Where from?" "South of Billings," Abner said. "Been up in the hills trapping, but I'm done with cold winters and empty pockets." Cray nodded, motioning toward the stew. "Eat something. We'll talk later." Abner's eyes flicked to Sable. She turned away quick, but not before he saw her flinch when one of the men brushed past her too close. He walked to the table, took the tin bowl she handed him without a word, and sat. The stew was salty, hot, and thick enough to be decent. But it was not the food he was paying attention to. He was watching her. Outside, dusk came down like a curtain. Inside, the outlaws drank and laughed too loud, their guns always within reach. Sable moved between the stove and the table, silent, her long dark hair tied back in a rag, sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She did not speak unless spoken to. Later that night, when most of the men were passed out drunk or asleep, Abner slipped outside. He moved behind the cabin, into the trees, where his horse was tied off. He slid a small knife from his boot and cut a piece of cloth from his saddlebag a map. He knelt, spread it on a flat rock, and marked the cabin's location with a scratch of charcoal. "You do not belong here," a voice said behind him. He turned quick, but it was her. Sable stood 10 feet away, arms crossed tight over her chest, her face unreadable. "I know," he said. "Neither do you." She looked at him hard. "They killed my family. Took me. I do not cook because I want to. I figured. Why are you really here?" He stood slowly. "To get you out." She blinked. "You do not know me. I do not need to. I saw your face when he grabbed your arm earlier. That's enough." She stared at him as if trying to decide whether to trust him or scream. "You will get yourself killed," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But I am not leaving you here." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she whispered, "Tomorrow night. They will be drunk. Cray leaves the cabin to meet someone near the ridge." Abner nodded. "I saw the trail. You can slip out with me then." "No," he said. "I will slip out with you." "No, Ken about it." She gave a tiny, broken laugh. The first sound of softness he had heard from her. Then she turned and disappeared back into the dark. The next day moved slow. The outlaws were tense, watching the ridge, expecting a delivery. Cray was irritable, snapping orders, and Sable kept her head down. Abner played his part quiet, steady, pretending not to notice how they spoke to her, how they stood too close. That night, the fire burned low. Cray saddled up and rode out with one man, leaving 4 behind. 2 were already asleep. 1 was passed out in the corner. The last paced the porch, chewing tobacco and muttering to himself. Abner waited until the guard moved to relieve himself in the trees. Then he moved fast. He opened the back door, slipped inside, and caught Sable by the wrist. Now, they moved together, quiet as breath. Through the back, past the woodpile, down the slope into the trees. Her shoes were thin, and she stumbled once, but he caught her. They reached his horse. He lifted her up, swung up behind her, and they rode hard into the trees. Behind them, a shot rang out. The guard had seen them. They ducked low, racing through the brush. A second shot whistled past. Then silence. They did not stop until the moon was high and the trail behind them was lost in shadow. Abner finally pulled the horse to a halt near a creek, breathing hard. He dismounted, helped her down. She was shaking. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "We will rest here till sunrise," he said. "Then we head west." Sable nodded, sinking to the ground. Her face was pale, lips trembling. He crouched beside her. "You did good." "I was so scared," she whispered. "I know. I thought I would never get out." He looked at her, then reached out and brushed a leaf from her hair. "You are out now." She looked up at him, and in the moonlight, her eyes were wide and shining full of fear, but also something else. Something he felt in his chest like a match catching fire. "Hope. You came for me," she said. "I would come for you again," Abner said. "Even if it meant dying." Her breath caught. Then, for the first time in months, Sable leaned into someone's arms and felt safe. They woke to a cold dawn, the kind that bleaches color from the trees and stiffens fingers before first light has even touched the earth. Abner had kept watch most of the night, crouched near the coals with his rifle across his lap. Sable had curled against a log, wrapped in his coat, her head tilted slightly toward the fire's last warmth. When she stirred, it was quiet, no cry, no gasp. Just her eyes opening slow, as if the fear from the night before had settled into something deeper, something more measured. He offered her dried apples and a strip of venison. "We'll follow the creek west," he said, once she'd eaten enough to keep walking. "There's a line cabin a day and a half from here. Belongs to a man I worked with rounding cattle last spring. It'll be empty this time of year." "Does he know you're coming?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "No, but he leaves it open for riders passing through. Always has." Sable pulled her braid loose, fingers working through the tangles. "What if they're tracking us already?" "They might be, but I laid false sign along the ridge before we left. Took Cray's horse, sent all the way south." She looked at him, just long enough to let that detail settle. "You planned this before you even spoke to me. I didn't know who you were yet, but I knew someone was hurting." They didn't speak more after that. The trail narrowed between granite outcroppings and thick stands of lodgepole pine. The horse moved slow and careful, hooves muffled by damp earth. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin. A raven circled above the treetops, calling once before gliding west. "Tell me something true," Sable said, her voice low behind him. "So I know who I'm riding with." "I had a younger brother," Abner said. "He drowned in the Milk River when I was 16. I was supposed to be watching him." She didn't answer right away. "Then, I had a sister, Emmeline. She used to sing while she put up peaches. Loud and off-key. You couldn't stop her. Is she gone too?" Sable nodded against his back. The sun was near setting when the cabin came into view, a low, narrow structure with one shutter hanging crooked. Smoke-blackened stones ringed a long, dead fire pit. Abner dismounted, checked the door, then waved her forward. "No one's been here in months." There was dust on the floor and a birch broom leaning in the corner. A single cot occupied the far wall, its blanket moth-eaten but dry. "I'll sleep by the door," he said, unrolling his bedroll. Sable moved past him, fingers trailing along the rough beam above the hearth. "I need to clean something," she said, "even if it's just this." She found a scrap of cloth in the saddlebag and began wiping down the table. Her movements were steady, her shoulders squared. Abner lit a fire and set a pot to boil. Neither of them spoke for a long while. When the water steamed, he sat across from her and said, "There's a place west of here, past the Bitterroots. I ran cattle there for a widow last year. She paid fair, and no one asked questions." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there's land, and work, and quiet. If you wanted to go that way." Sable looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were healing from old burns, the skin along one thumb still pink from where a knife had slipped. "I don't have anything left," she said. "Not a name worth using. Not a single coin. You've got breath in your lungs and your own 2 feet. That's more than most." She looked up slowly. "Why are you being kind to me?" "Because I've seen what people become when no one is." The fire snapped, sending sparks against the blackened stone. She stood, walked to the door, and stared out into the trees. "I don't know how to be free anymore. I still wake up expecting to hear them shouting." "You're not theirs anymore," Abner said, rising. You're not anyone's but your own. She turned then, slowly. Her eyes were darker in the firelight, but steadier now. I don't know if I'm ready to believe that, she said. You don't have to. Just stay beside me until you are. They stood like that for a long while, neither reaching, neither retreating, just the space between them softening, like ice giving way to spring water. When she finally sat again, it was closer than before. Not touching, but near enough that their breaths found the same rhythm. Outside, the wind carried the sound of far-off wolves. But inside the cabin, there was only stillness. Not peace yet, but the beginning of it. By the second morning in the line cabin, the wind had shifted. It rose off the mountains carrying the scent of fir sap and wet stone, and when Abner stepped out to check the horse, the clouds trailing the ridgeline looked heavy enough to break. Inside, Sable had taken to boiling water in the old tin kettle she'd scrubbed clean the night before. She moved slower today, but deliberate, folding each motion into the rhythm of the room. Her hands no longer trembled when she reached for the hearth tools. She didn't look over her shoulder anymore. Abner ducked back in with a bundle of dry pine and set it beside the firebox. You ever try your hand at teaching? He asked, brushing pine needles from his sleeves. She glanced up. Not unless you count showing my cousin how to trap quail without breaking their legs. Still counts. I only ask because near Lewiston there's a one-room schoolhouse that lost its teacher last spring. Widow woman who ran it passed from fever. The town's been asking around for someone willing. I don't know letters well enough to teach. You read that ledger book last night, same one I couldn't make sense of. That's numbers. I was always good with those. You could learn the rest. I know a man who could get you paper and primers. Sable set the kettle aside, heat blooming across her cheekbones. I'm not sure I belong in a place like that. She looked down at her skirt, the hem still frayed from weeks rough on the trail. Folks see a woman alone. They start wondering where she's been. Let them, Abner said. You've got nothing to answer for. She didn't respond, but she didn't look away, either. Her eyes lingered on him longer now, as if measuring something not just in words but in weight. Around midday, they packed what little they had and saddled up. The snow line was still high, but the sky looked uncertain, and the trail westward wouldn't stay dry much longer. They rode in silence for some time, the pine giving way to open stretch, where the land rolled low and golden with late summer grasses. By late afternoon, they stopped by a spring-fed pool where the cottonwoods leaned crooked over the bank. While Abner refilled their canteens, Sable crouched by the water and dipped her hands in. The cold made her gasp. She laughed once, soft and surprised. I haven't heard that sound yet, Abner said, straightening. I didn't mean to. It just came out. You should let it come out more. She ran her wet hands down her sleeves. It feels strange. To laugh. Like it doesn't quite fit anymore. Maybe you just need something to laugh about. Sable glanced at the horse, then back to him. You ever been in love, Abner? He didn't answer right away. He sat on a flat rock, set his hat beside him. Once. I was 17. She married a blacksmith in Miles City. I left before their first child was born. Sable stood slowly, the wind tugging her braid to one side. Did you love her enough to stay? I loved her enough not to. That night, they camped beneath a bluff shaped like a sleeping bison. The wind kept low, but the stars were sharp and endless. Abner carved a shallow trench for the fire and kept it small, banked with stone. Sable sat cross-legged near the flame, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of boiled chicory. I've been thinking about your offer, she said. He shifted, careful not to interrupt. If I say yes, to Lewiston, to starting over, I need to do it as myself. Not someone hiding behind pity. I never pitied you. I know that now. She looked over at him, chin lifted slightly. I've done things I'm not proud of. I never gave them my body, but I gave them my silence. I cooked for them while they told stories of who they'd killed. I cleaned their boots knowing they tracked blood in with them. I didn't fight back. You survived, he said. There's no shame in that. I want to believe that. Abner leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Then I'll help you believe it. Every day? As long as you let me. The fire crackled once, loud in the hush between them. She set her cup down and reached out, not all the way, just enough that her hand brushed his. Don't leave, she said. I won't. She shifted closer, her shoulder warm against his. It wasn't a kiss or a promise spoken out loud. But when she laid her head against him, it felt like something stronger than either. Not rescue. Not obligation. Just two people choosing the same direction, with the same quiet certainty. The rain came soft just before dawn. tapping steady on the canvas of the shelter Abner had rigged between two cedars. Sable lay beside him beneath the oilskin blankets, her back curved toward the fire's last embers, one hand curled loosely near her face. Her breathing was even, but her brow twitched every so often, as if dreams still tugged at the corners of her mind. Abner rose without waking her. The ground was damp, but not soaked yet. He walked down to the creek with his rifle slung low, boots squelching in the moss. A rabbit had left tracks near the bank, and he followed them through the underbrush until he caught sight of its ears. The shot cracked through the hush and scattered a pair of jays from the trees. When he returned, Sable had already stirred the fire back to life and was kneeling beside it, coaxing flame from dry twigs she'd found under the overhang. "You're early," she said, not looking up. "You're awake," he returned, holding up the rabbit. She took it without hesitation and began to work. They ate in silence, steam rising from the meat. The air smelled clean, like wet bark and smoke. "I had a dream," she said once they'd finished. "I was back in the old house. Not the cabin our home from before. The table was set, and my mother was slicing apples. She kept humming that song about the crows and the wheat field." "I remember that one," Abner said, shifting the firewood to dry it closer to the coals. "My mother used to sing it when thunder rolled in. In the dream, I kept trying to tell her something, but my mouth wouldn't open." Abner glanced over, then waited. "When I looked down, I didn't have hands, just knives where they should have been. I tried to hide them under the table, but the blood kept leaking out." She ran her fingers along the edge of her sleeve, smoothing the seam. "I woke up before she saw." He didn't offer comfort by way of words, just passed her his canteen and kept his eyes on the fire. "We'll reach Lewiston by midday tomorrow," he said. "There's a woman there named Mrs. Halbert. She's near 70, runs the boarding house above the cooper's shop. She's hard of hearing but honest." Sable nodded once. "You trust her. I worked for her son last fall. She gave me a room when I was laid up with a fever. I'll pay her what I can once I find work," she said. "You won't owe a thing," he said. "She takes in who she wants, and she'll want you." Sable looked at him then, studying the lines around his mouth, the way his collar had frayed clean through on one side. "I won't stay if you're just passing me off," she said. "If I'm only another name on your conscience." He turned toward her, slow and sure. "I'm not passing you off. I'm trying to build something with you, not for you." She didn't answer right away. The rain had eased into a mist, and droplets clung to her lashes like glass. "I've never had anything that wasn't taken from me," she said. Even before the Outlaws, it was one loss after the next. Crops, kin, the little things like a good pair of shoes or a letter from a friend. "You'll have something now," Abner said, "because I won't let anyone take it from you." She looked down. "You talk like it's that simple." "It isn't," he said, "but it's true." They broke camp by late morning, the horse loaded light, and the trail widening through open country. Grasses brushed their boots, and the wind carried the scent of horses from far off, maybe a ranch they couldn't yet see. The road into Lewiston would fork near Blacktail Gulch. From there, it wouldn't be far. As the sun pushed through the thinning clouds, Sable reached across the saddle horn and brushed her fingers lightly against Abner's. "I don't expect promises," she said. "Good," he replied, "because I don't make them light. Only the ones I mean to keep." She didn't pull her hand away. By dusk, the lights of Lewiston winked in the valley below, warm and steady. Children chased each other between the sheds, and a dog barked behind a fence. The smell of yeast and wood smoke drifted up the hill. They rode in side by side, not as strangers, not as fugitives, as something new. And when Mrs. Halbert opened her door and waved them in without asking a single question, Sable stepped across the threshold with both feet and didn't look back. Lewiston was smaller than Sable expected. The buildings leaned slightly with the weight of weather, and the streets were mostly packed dirt, edged by troughs filled with rainwater. The cooper's sign swung on rusted hinges, and the boarding house above it smelled faintly of starch and old apples. But the room was dry, and the bed was hers, and no one touched her without asking. She spent the first 2 days walking the perimeter of town and saying little. She watched the way people moved, how the men tipped their hats without leering, how the women gathered by the well and spoke with their hands half covered in flour or soap. No one asked her name. No one asked where she'd come from. On the third morning, Abner met her on the porch with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing it over. Inside were writing slates, a stub of chalk, and a primer with the spine stitched in red thread. She looked at him sideways. You think I'm ready? I think you're already doing it. Might as well have the tools. I haven't even spoken to the town elders yet. They've already spoken to me. Their boy broke his leg last spring, and I helped set it. They remember favors. She held the primer for a long moment. What if I lose their trust? You won't. And if I do? Then we start somewhere new. But I don't think we'll need to. That evening, he walked her to the schoolhouse. The door creaked on its hinges, but the inside was dry and held the faint scent of beeswax and ink. Dust caught the last of the light in the windows. Sable ran her fingers over the edge of the desk, where initials had been carved deep into the wood. I never sat in a place like this, she said. Never had a teacher. You'll be one they remember. She turned and looked at him, not just his face, but the whole of him, the way he leaned slightly on his right side from an old injury, the way his shirt pulled tight over his shoulders when he crossed his arms, the quiet steadiness he carried like a second skin. You don't look at me like I'm broken. You're not. She stepped closer. I thought I'd never feel safe again. You are now. Her hand found his, rough palm to rough palm, and he closed his fingers around hers like he'd been waiting for her to ask. I want to build something that doesn't have to be hidden, she said. Then let's build it. They didn't kiss right away. There was no rush, no desperation. Just the quiet knowledge of a door opening and neither of them turning away. The next morning, she stood at the front of the schoolhouse while 5 children filed in, boots muddy and eyes wide. She tapped the slate once with the chalk and said, My name is Miss Corman. Let's begin. Abner spent the morning helping the blacksmith haul timber, but he paused near the schoolhouse at midday, just long enough to hear her laugh through the open window. It was low and warm, and it filled something in him that had gone quiet for too long. He didn't linger. He didn't need to. Weeks passed. The air cooled, and the trees turned brittle gold. Sable's hands grew ink-stained, her voice stronger. She taught with her sleeves rolled up and her braid pinned tight, and when the children asked questions she didn't know, she found the answers by nightfall. Abner took work repairing fence lines and clearing brush for a widower with too much land and not enough help. He came home with splinters in his palms and stories about a calf that wouldn't nurse or a chicken that chased him down the lane. She listened with her feet tucked beneath her and her hand resting lightly on his knee. One evening after supper, they sat on the back steps of the boarding house, watching the last of the light slip behind the ridge. I bought a parcel, he said. She looked up. Where? South edge of town, near the old cottonwood grove. It's not much, but there's a stream and the soil's good. She turned to face him fully. You want a farm? I want to stay. I want to build a place where you can hang your coat without looking over your shoulder. She breathed in slow. I want that too. Then marry me. She didn't blink. She didn't ask if he was sure. She just nodded once and then leaned in, her forehead against his. Yes. They were married beneath the cottonwoods 3 weeks later, with Mrs. Halbert standing behind Sable and the blacksmith's wife holding a ribbon of wildflowers. The town pastor spoke soft and plain, and when Abner said, I will, he didn't have to raise his voice for everyone to hear. That winter, they moved into the cabin Abner built by hand, each board nailed with care, each window facing the light. Sable brought her primer and her slate and taught the neighbors' children by the fire when snow made the schoolhouse too far to reach. Abner carved her a desk from pine and set it by the window. They never spoke again of the cabin where she'd been kept, or the men who'd stolen her voice. But some nights, when the wind rose and the fire burned low, she would rest her head against his shoulder and say, I didn't think I'd live to see a day like this. And he would answer, There will be more. He was right. They planted a garden in spring radishes, beans, squash. She filled the windowsill with jars of dried mint and lavender. He built a second chair for the porch, and they sat there evenings after supper, fingers tangled, watching the sky change. They never left Lewiston. They never needed to. Their life was not grand, nor fast, nor filled with riches, but it was theirs. And every morning, when the sun crept over the cottonwoods, Sable rose beside the man who had seen her, not as a shadow of what she was, but as the whole of who she had become. That was enough. That was everything.